Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall and we talked about story in tabletop role-playing games. Specifically, I wanted to know about when it is appropriate to sacrifice story in order to allow a game to run more smoothly. I started the interview by asking Jason, is story the most important thing in a tabletop role-playing game? I'll jump across the interview now, but first, remember to subscribe to our channel, and thanks for watching.
No, not at all. I think that the play experience, the actual fun factor, as they computer games use the term all the time, the fun factor. I think that that ultimately is the most important part of a tabletop gaming experience. I think that narrative is a wonderful tool to help give that context. I think that mechanics are absolutely essential to try to give some structure and to set that gameplay up. But I mean, ultimately, the most important thing for a tabletop role-playing game, in my opinion, is the gestalt of players interacting with the game master and creating a shared, fun, and interesting experience. And I use the word fun not necessarily as a like it has to be lighthearted and haha entertaining, but fun as in it has to be engaging. It has to be fun in the same way that a horror film can be fun, that a thriller can be fun. You know, watching John McClane sprint across a broken glass floor. I mean, that's not entertaining, but that's an amazingly fun scene, you know, just and I think that that's ultimately what the real thrill of role-playing games are.
So under what circumstances do you need to sacrifice story in order to maximize that game fun?
There are a number of cases where that becomes prevalent. I find that one thing that players love to do that is utterly absent in narrative or almost non-existent is things like crafting, about the leveling up process, about the sort of min-maxing your characters, like the idea of the spreadsheet play or figuring out your character's paper doll, their representation in the world, upgrading your skills incrementally. Like if you level up in a level-based game, the fun of sitting around and doing that mechanical, like this is my new ability, this is what I do, this is the shopping in between sessions. A lot of that stuff is actually really tremendously fun, and it can breed a lot of great gameplay, but it certainly doesn't serve narrative. I mean, the only, other than maybe Harry Potter or Luke Skywalker training on Dagobah, I can't think of very many training montages or sitting around and learning from my experiences, scenes in literature or fiction or film that are dramatically interesting. Yeah, that's a really important and fun part of character building and part of investment in your character. The other part is the sort of like when you're trading back and forth to try to figure out like who does what, and niche protection, like, well, it makes more sense if, for example, I'll use an example from the Lords of the Middle Sea game. The player playing Carlos, the ship's mechanic, he's also good in his technical skill is awfully high. And so he's also probably better than anyone else in handling the ship's radios. But I mean, he's the engineer. His job is to be in the engine room, hammering on the mechanics, keeping the rotors going, keeping the engine humming. And yet, whenever somebody gets a radio call, it's dramatically more interesting to have the character, who is, happens to be near the radio to be trying to make the calls. Whereas mechanically, you might be like, well, Carlos should go handle the radio too, but that's not as fun. And so ultimately, I think that the like one of the emergent parts of gameplay that is tremendously fun is when players start sort of strategically deciding who does what and how that works. And that is also something that happens at the tabletop level. It's not something that is representative narrative very well. It's not something that actually lends itself well to even computer game stuff.
I follow that, and I think you're right. The only montages that I can think of are things like Rocky, and those are very quick. Like the idea is that you have it Get it
Like,
out of the way. You're
how
not.
many shopping montages have you seen in films that aren't like, somebody trying on outfits? And,
Absolutely.
not many. It's like a whirlwind of outfits, but you never see somebody haggling over like, I'm going to get a new sword because this one does D8 plus 2 damage versus this one does D8 plus 1. That kind of stuff you don't see, but it's investment in time and character.
This all makes sense to me, but my follow-up question would be, some of the examples you've given here are things that are narratively maybe not that interesting, and they make sense. I understand why you sacrifice the story because, frankly, they're not the most interesting parts of the story. What about moments where they are exciting ideas or they are exciting concepts? They are normally parts of the story that you would include. Under what circumstances might you sacrifice or pull back, cut a scene, or shorten elements of story when they are naturally exciting?
I find sometimes to be really long fight sequences to just get the wind down. For example, if there's a huge fight scene and it's clear the tide has turned, the battle will be decided. Sitting around and having the player characters just whittle through a bunch of already defeated or demoralized villains is kind of dull, and so just cutting to they surrender, or I'm fairly quick often to just say, okay, a curtain goes down at this point. We cut to, it's a couple of minutes later. The rest of the foes are on the ground. Everyone make a luck roll, and I might include some, like throw a few hit points of damage to everybody. But I said, you basically chop your way through the rest of the fight, and now you're ready to move on. Those sorts of things I find are best handled through just dramatic foreshortening. I am all too happy to drop the railroad or to drop players on the railroad from time to time and just say, this is how it happens. You have the ability to react to it, but this is the shape that the narrative is going to happen. In our informal chat earlier, you mentioned like, this is where the villain gets away, or the villain falls to the ground. I mean, most player characters being as completely psychotically completist will be like, we put 8 shots into his head and then we cut off the head and then we pile rocks all over the body and then we burn it. They'd be like making absolutely sure the villain is dead, but I'm like, he's dead. Let's move on. And then later, some henchmen come and pick him up and he vows revenge.
So what about a element of story which maybe isn't necessarily that interesting, but all the same, you don't cut? Is there something that on the surface seems like shopping, seems like, leveling up, that you kind of want to skip through, you kind of want to do the montage, but even still, you'll keep it there because it's important for pacing or for feel?
Sometimes I really like to give player characters the chance to connect with NPCs that sort of flesh out their backstories. And I'm occasionally more guilty of this than I should be online, because since we sort of have to regulate and monitor how we're playing online, because it's a very weirdly constrained environment, talking to people one-on-one. You can't have multiple people chatting at a time. It's very like you can't really, Jamie and the game master are talking over here, but I'm going to talk with my friend over here. You can't really do side conversations very easily in online play. And so everyone needs to be focused. But I find that it is actually a valuable thing to give player characters the chance to have emotionally resonant conversations with NPCs that are not relevant to the plot. For example, when characters in Lords of the Middle Sea, when characters activate contacts they have in world, like the various places they visit. It's like, I know a guy, it's a mechanic. His name is Chucky. He works at the air docks. He's a good friend of mine. And so, we'll have the player character will go have this conversation with the NPC. It's not dramatically relevant to anything that's going to happen in the adventure, but the player really wants to do that scene. And so I think that that's kind of important. Just like if they go out later and they decide to have some partying, and one of the player characters, strikes up a conversation with the bartender about local events, even if they have nothing to do with the overall plot. I think for the player, they're thinking, this is interesting to me. I would like to pursue this. And sometimes I need to get better about it for online play because it usually means 4 other players are just sitting there watching. But I think that kind of thing is really important to just adding to the flavor of a world and giving each player a chance to sort of assert their realness in the setting.
I've got one more question to finish this topic on. If
Sure.
you had to give some advice to a GM who is going to be approaching a scene and they're not necessarily sure whether they should skip over it, is there like a guiding principle that you have in mind about how you approach story and whether it's going to be relevant or not?
Yeah, I guess ultimately I would give the classic screenwriting advice in that just think, what is the primary point of this scene? Like, if you had to summarize this scene in one sentence, what would that sentence be? And then let all of, you can have the small talk naturally occur. You can have you can describe the setting. You can, add filigree to your narration as much as you want, but ultimately figure out what is the primary point of this scene and how can I direct the player character to that. And if you can't get there from here, if you just think, well, this is the sort of thing that isn't really necessary, you can just blip over it. Just say, you ask around for a while and then you realize that the person you're looking for is in that old abandoned building. They seem to be hiding out there. Some street kids have seen them going to and from. And then that's all the information you need. You've added a little flavor. Where did that source of information come from? You can decide whether it's valid or not. But, if there's not an actual point to be had by expanding a scene out, then just provide the information and move on. If it's relevant to let the player really feel like they're being an investigative person, if somebody has prided themselves on their street smart and their ability to acclimate and to connect to, the street culture, then sure, let them have these conversations, but ultimately make sure that, boom, that piece of information is dropped in and established as quickly as possible. And then the other little bit of advice I would say is then just cut. I mean, once the piece of information is there, there's no reason to keep going. Don't be afraid of doing the Star Wars screen wipe where, just like cut to next scene. What are you up to?